Good morning, Chatham House. Good morning, world. My name is Agnes Kigotho from the Common Futures Conversations, and I'll be taking you through this BLM interview where I'll be targeting and focusing my interview on police brutality. I will be hosting the lovely Nafula Wafula, who's the Commonwealth Youth Council Vice Chairperson in charge of policy and advocacy. So, Nafula, tell us, in terms of police brutality in Kenya, has there been significant progress or change since the eruption of the Black Lives Matter protest?
Since the eruption of the Black Lives Matter protests, I think so.
Yes.
First of all, it's important to look at it through there's two different lenses. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's the question of whether the Black Lives Matter protests have really impacted our reality here in Kenya. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's so far away and it's such a different reality as much as the issues
Yes.
are interconnected. And it's just the same way you'd ask, has the Me Too movement impacted issues of sexual and gender-based violence and sexual harassment in Kenya? So for me, I see those two as interconnected in terms of the issues they address, in terms of the root cause of the issues they address, but whether the Black Lives Matter has protests and movement have impacted our policing in Kenya, I don't think so. I see those two as very separate. The only things that I think the thing that I think the Black Lives Matter protests have done is all of a sudden they've created this viewpoint. They've created a viewpoint where people can see that our issues do not exist in a silo. And so it's not just us, and it's not just what's happening here in Kenya, it's happening everywhere else. And it anchored the conversation into a larger dialogue, but it hasn't really impacted the occurrences in this country. It hasn't really impacted the way in which the issues are addressed, because in many ways it is still it's still an issue that is big within. It's big in both countries, but with very different contexts and very different approaches or mechanisms when you're looking at addressing the issue.
One of the principles of the Black Lives Matter is restorative justice and a commitment to collectively, lovingly, and courageously working for freedom and equality for Black people. What steps are needed in Kenya to work towards this?
So I think, first of all, it's important for us, if you're talking about police brutality in Kenya, then, and we're talking about Black Lives Matter, and this is what I kept, this was very important even as we were doing the Black Lives Matter KE protest, so the Black Lives Matter Kenya group, which currently exists on, we have a group on WhatsApp, we have around 210 people. Some of them are expats living in Kenya and some are Kenyans. But the idea was we need to create that connection of issues, because otherwise it will only be Kenyans protesting about an issue that's happening in the US. And while we understand that collectively as Black people, it is important when you're looking at decolonization, when you're looking at Afrocentrism, or just that when you're looking at Black people collectively, the structural issues that would affect Black people in the US and the structural issues that would affect me as a Kenyan in a previously colonized country are not so different. Therefore, as Black people in Kenya, we have every right to support Black people in the US or in any other country, Western country, that are protesting against police brutality. But if you're talking about the same issue within a Kenyan context, it means we have to take that issue and make it a local context, or localize it. So building that connection is very important. And that was at the core of us, of what we do, and even the organizing and the meetings that we have had since the protests, was that issue of being able to connect the issues and help the persons living, whether it's expatriates living in Kenya, to be able to understand the importance of them showing up to Kenyan protests, importance of them supporting Kenyan organizations working within police brutality, and importance of them supporting grassroots organizing in Kenya. just as much as they would in the US, because this is also their home, and structural inequality is very interconnected. So in response to your question, I think the most important thing, one, would be, I think being able to recognize the power of grassroots organizing is one. So we need to invest in, not really invest in, but we need to support grassroots organizing. I feel like for a long time, the conversations around human rights, particularly on the big or major platforms, have been carried by large organizations like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and they're doing an amazing job. But guess what? At the end of the day, when that young person is shot in a slum in Nairobi, the first person to respond will be a young activist from a social justice center in that slum area. It's going to be that grassroots activist that will be the first responder. They're the ones who will go to the police station to support the mothers and widows of victims. So I think it's important for us to be able to strengthen and support grassroots organizations, grassroots activists, if we are to actually make a difference in communities. The second thing I think is the approach that I'm seeing. I've seen that in the US, particularly in the US, there's been a lot of protests, because what happens is people get angry. And when people are angry, when systems are not working and you're pushed to the corner, protest becomes the only language that you can speak. And that is what's happening even here in Kenya as it pertains to this particular issue. But I think it's also important for us to begin to look at ways in which we can sit at the table, and recognize that colonialism destroyed the essence of what we understand as leadership and authority by imposing structures that didn't exist in our systems prior. So even our police and security systems and structures are built on colonial systems that look at the police as an authority looking to impose upon the masses, as opposed to them being part of a community. So I think community dialogue and being on the table with the police and understanding their needs as well, and them as part of the community, them seeing themselves as part of the community and us seeing them as part of the community, will begin to create a systems change, as opposed to this symptomatic approach that we have been taking towards addressing this particular issue.
Do you feel there is freedom of expression to demand this?
Kenya has come a long way since the promulgation of our constitution, actually, which is turning 10 in, I think, 3 days, 28th of August. And so we've had some progress and we've had some setbacks. Do I think that I have more freedom of expression as a Kenyan today compared to the freedom of expression that existed 10, 15 years ago? Yes. The fact that I can even go on Twitter and criticize the government and not be afraid someone will come and knock down my door, or the fact that I can go and sit down with a government official or tweet to a government official and talk about an issue like police brutality, I think is progress. That said, we have still criminalized protest in this country in ways that are ridiculous. So Article 37 of the Constitution protects the right to picket, the right to protest. The police are meant to protect you when you go out to the street, as long as you follow due process and you've given notice. That said, today, as we speak, there are people who have been arrested in Mombasa for protesting. Yesterday, people were arrested in Nakuru. So this is happening. What's happening is protest has been criminalized. And we can't talk about an issue such as police brutality without talking about what is essential to democracy. And protest is essential to democracy. So I feel like there is more freedom of expression than there was before, but I still feel like there's more work to do. And the more work that exists is to ensure that the rights we have fought for for so long, that they were enshrined in the Constitution, should be protected and should be guarded. And by protecting them, we ensure that we do not take any steps back.
From your perspective, are there any concerns of Kenyan and African youth that are not prominent enough in the Black Lives Matter movement?
Black Lives Matter, just like Me Too, was created with a particular context in mind.
Yeah.
So it was created with US politics, systems,
Mm-hmm.
structures in mind. When you look at it, I
Mm-hmm.
think substantially, when you look at the substance, like completely,
Yeah.
that's what I feel like that's what I feel like it responds to. It's very contextual. But
Yeah.
I feel like the spirit of it is what you can take and fit into any other context that exists, whether that's in the UK,
Mm-hmm.
whether that's in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So it, when you look at the substance of it, I think what it hasn't responded to is stuff that doesn't really fit into their context. So, for example, decolonization is not a huge thing. And when I say decolonization, I mean um, you can see that in the US. Oh no, actually, that's quite wrong. Because I was about to give the example of how in the US, in the UK, for example, when the Black Lives Matter protest moved to the like when you look at it within a UK context, there's a lot of focus on let's say the removal of statues that represent
Yeah.
racism, right?
Structural
While in the
racism.
US that's not the case, but it's true. I've seen in the
Mm-hmm.
US as well. There's the removal of all these statues that represent white supremacy. So I think that's what I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying. Like when you look at the spirit of it, I feel like a lot of the issues, whatever context you're in, would be able to apply and respond to the different needs. As a
Mm-hmm.
Kenyan, because race is not a particular is not the exact approach that I would use while talking about Black Lives Matter here and how it would fit contextually here.
Yeah.
I think that the spirit of the movement is what sticks out to me, and therefore the way it responds to the structural inequalities that
Yeah.
exist within the different contexts. And in
Mm-hmm.
my context as a Kenyan or as a young African, it's the
Mm-hmm.
structural inequalities that were ingrained or that were solidified by
Yeah.
colonialism. So I feel like Black Lives Matter, because it was I feel like Black Lives Matter could if I'm to take it into a Kenyan or African context, I would
Yeah.
mold it more around decolonization to make it
Mm-hmm.
respond more to my reality as an African young person,
Mm-hmm.
um, around the destruction of colonial structures that still exist,
Mm-hmm.
um, and also around looking at structural, widening the lens of what the structural inequality really means. So
Okay.
as opposed to just looking at it contextually through race, I would widen that into, for example, in Kenya, when you're talking about police brutality, it would be
Mm-hmm.
the religious minorities that exist, you know, and how that affects them. When you're talking about counterterrorism and anti-radicalization, it would look at socioeconomic inequalities that exist. It would look at gender, so in terms of how sexual and gender-based violence is used as a tool, for
Yeah.
example, or sexual harassment is used as a
Yeah.
tool to suppress the rights of young women, even as they report cases or when they're arrested and stuff like that. So I feel like um, if you look at it contextually and you don't mold it
Mm-hmm.
around, or we don't mold it around our realities and our needs, then it just doesn't respond to our issues. The racial inequalities that we see in the
Mm-hmm.
US happen here, although they'd happen it would be like a micro, you know, a micro lens context, because we don't have as much of a racial disparity in Kenya,
Mm-hmm.
but we still have those inequalities. So I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
give you an example before I respond to what you said. Someone in the group had mentioned that it would be important to talk about the fact that the disparity in how expats are paid and how locals are paid in Kenya, especially in
Mm-hmm.
international organizations and companies that exist in this country that have expats working here. And that is
Yeah.
inequality, and it exists to a very large sense. And it's the same even with hotels. We had a hotel here that would only cater to people that came from outside the country, you know. But if
Mm-hmm.
you're a Kenyan and you called, apparently there were stories of, if you called with a Kenyan accent, how that tell you there are no rooms, but then if you twisted your accents a little, then perhaps they'd tell you, okay, fine, we have a room. And they'd still make every person, including myself as a Kenyan, apparently, pay for airport transfer, although I live in the same country. And so those disparities exist. But the thing is, what Black Lives Matter has done and what those conversations have done is they've sparked conversations here around racial inequalities that perhaps we didn't have before. And what those conversations have done is they've put a spotlight on these businesses, these companies, these practices, whether it's the ranches, because that's another thing that we don't often talk about that it needs to be spoken about, is how we have ranches here owned by persons that are Kenyan nationals, but well, there's no other way to say this, owned by, say, British nationals or white people. They've come, and it's a difficult topic to talk about, but we need to, because thousands of acres have been bought. Some people own as many as 88,000 acres of land. Well, the communities around them, the locals around them, do not have that access to that land, and they can't, and they are herding communities. They herd, they have cows, they have goats. And when there's drought, what happens is there's so much clashing and issues between the owners of the ranches and the local communities, because the local communities cannot access that land in order for their animals to feed and in order for them to survive. And that is a topic that, if we dig deeper, is about structural inequality. And those are the conversations that we are not having. So I think it's going to be really, really important for us, even now that this spark has begun, and that we're having more honest conversations around inequalities, around racial injustice, that we have very honest conversations about ourselves and legacies of colonialism, and no matter how uncomfortable they are.
Nafula, tell us, what are some of the challenges you have faced as an activist and woman of color?
I think I'm going to focus more on my experiences as an activist, as a woman. And then maybe if anything pops up on being a woman of color, I can just bring it in there. But for me, it wouldn't be as much of an issue as being Nafula as an activist, maybe in the US or in the UK. So I think, first of all, is that, so my focus, my activism focus is on human rights and gender. And you'll find that a lot of times when I'm doing my activism, it's like there is this implication, it's a silent implication, that I should be talking more about gender and issues affecting women. And I have a right to speak about that. And it's like you don't have as much of a right to speak about other issues, And so you need to stomp your foot harder in order to be recognized, or for your efforts to be recognized within the movement, as it pertains to other issues, as opposed to, like, if I was just doing my activism as it pertains to feminism and gender. It's like my voice is more valid if I'm talking about issues that affect me as a woman, and not issues that affect us as a collective. And therefore, unfortunately, the truth is, within the movement, or within the human rights space, patriarchy also exists within the space or within the movement. And it's something that we wouldn't like to believe or talk about as much, because we'd like to believe that we are progressive. But the undertones and the connotations still exist even within the movement. But I'd say also, just as a woman of color, I only recognize that I'm a woman of color when I'm outside of the country, when I travel, or when I'm working within contexts that are not particularly centered around just the continent or my country. And I'd like to, I haven't seen any outright discrimination per se as an individual, but I know what exists. I know the systemic discrimination or challenges that would affect activists or women of color, even as it pertains, let's say, to access to resources or just perceptions that exist. Say, I'm going to give you just one small example before we move on to the next topic. there's a Facebook group that has humanitarian, only humanitarian workers, and my co-founder is a member of one of the groups. And it's interesting because every time she posted a link to a GoFundMe or a fundraiser, it was never approved.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer that she was given was, this is not a fundraising platform. And it seemed as if there was a perception that because she is a woman running a grassroots organization from the global south, she's always going to be just looking for money, money for a project, money for this. But they didn't have the same perception when it came to other women that were not women of color within the humanitarian space that would go to the same virtual space to ask for support or advice. Yeah.
Okay. So for you as an activist during your protest and all that, have you faced any brutality from police, and is it different from being a woman and a man? So tell me your experience.
Yeah. So I personally haven't faced any brutality as an individual. I've been tear gassed before as part of a group of protesters, of course. But personally as an individual, I have not faced direct brutality from police. I have faced bullying. There's an online group which is quite big, and it's still not very clear whether it is run by a police officer or it's a pseudonym. But either way, it's a group that supports. It essentially supports police brutality, because what happens is a warning is posted. Let's say they point to one young person. They point this person, whoever runs a group, who calls himself a police officer, will post a picture and say, your days are counted. Yeah. And the next thing you see is the next image you'll see is an image of that young person, and they have been killed or shot, and the picture will be posted in the group. But that group also complains or talks about or has issues with human rights activists who work in the police brutality space. And there's one time when I received quite a number of messages from my inbox because of the posts I've been posting on police brutality. And I think either someone copy pasted my post and put it in the group, and it has thousands of members. But what I got was a lot of threats and insults into my inbox on Facebook. Other than that, I haven't faced anything in particular as an individual, particularly from the police. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful for that, because I know of other comrades, other friends that have not been as lucky. I've been arrested quite a number of times. So solidarity is really important, and being able to support each other during the process, and whether that's going to the police station, whether that's bringing in the lawyers, whether that's being able to fundraise for bail and bond for arrested persons, or whether that's just actually being on the table with the authorities and the government to look at the policy angle of what this issue is, to ensure that the people that we work with are also protected and are safe.
In conclusion, Nafula, tell us how collective action can help solve the problem of police brutality in Kenya in terms of accountability and new measures.
I think that's the thing that's the one lesson that I have learned this year. And I mean organizing during a pandemic, and organizing after, or organizing in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter and what's happening, is the importance of collective action. So I'd mentioned before that a lot of times we work in silos as activists, as human rights defenders. People work in silos, and I think that is our biggest undoing. And that is the biggest challenge, is that we do that. And so you find that when we work in silos, then we don't have all these other voices and all these other players that we can bring on board in order to make the issue stronger and our voices stronger. So for Black Lives Matter KE, organizing during a pandemic with all the different restrictions that existed, it required a level of creativity, a level of audacity, and solidarity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, it meant that we had to bring together the big organizations, like
Mm-hmm.
Amnesty, that would have the food power, or rather not the food power really, but have the resources to be able to create either it's posters, they have a huge online
Yeah.
following, and then you have the grassroots organizations that have a footing on the ground that will ensure people will turn up. And then we have the media houses, or the partners within the media space that will ensure that, because
Mm-hmm.
organizing during a pandemic means you're not bringing too many people together at once, unless you
Mm-hmm.
want guys to be arrested. It means that visibility is the best way
Yeah.
to get your message out. So media and social media is important. Then bringing together influencers and social media actors, bringing together gender activists, like
Mm-hmm.
that collective action and bringing different voices on board really helped. And now what we're trying to do is, what we have managed to begin to build, is collective action between citizens of Kenya and expatriates, which never
Mm-hmm.
existed before. Because when it was incredibly powerful to see expats show up to protests in Madare slums.
Yeah.
And we actually had a meeting, one meeting that was hosted by a lady who lives in Kenya. She's an American national, but hosting mothers and widows of victims
Mm-hmm.
alongside other experts in one space to talk about, these are the realities in Kenya, these are the realities in
Mm-hmm.
the US, and this is how they are interconnected. And oh, it was so powerful. And what that
Mm-hmm.
led to is, even the next time there were protests,
Mm-hmm.
the activists that were arrested, the bail and bond was
Mm-hmm.
crowdfunded, you know, by
That's
all these
that's
different
nice.
people that, even though couldn't show up to the protests, could give a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of money. And this money led to the release of all, I think there were around 53, if I'm not wrong, activists that had been arrested. So I guess this being the last question, and it's the most powerful question, I believe, is that it's important for us to understand the power of collective action. Yeah, if we're working in a silo, then you're not working the right way. We need to bring all the different voices on board, every different person on board, if we are to create an impact, including the voice of the police. We need to find
Mm-hmm.
allies in every different space that we can find allies in, if we are to deal with something as systemic as police brutality.
And do you feel there's enough accountability by perpetrators of police brutality? Are the police accountable? Relevant stakeholders, are they accountable? Is there some sort of
Yeah.
accountability, or is there rebellion? And additionally, lastly, do you find that brutality is targeted to a specific type of people, a social class in this country, like the poor and
Mm.
maybe youth?
Wow, that's okay. So I think I'll start with the second question first. I
Mm-hmm.
think police brutality, the same way in the US, it's not only Black people that die, but it's mostly Black people. Yeah. And to a large extent, it is a system that has been pitted against people of color.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's the same way in Kenya. Police brutality mostly affects persons living in informal urban settlements. We have
Mm-hmm.
criminalized poverty, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, if I'm a young person and I'm arrested in Kileleshwa, which is a high-end, middle class neighborhood here in
Yeah.
Kenya,
Mm-hmm.
I will not be afraid of being shot. But if I'm arrested in Madari, yeah, I'm outside, I'm in Madari out at curfew hours, I don't have a car, I'm walking, then I should be afraid. So here in Kenya, I think socioeconomically, if
Mm-hmm.
you're poor, it's more highly likely that you'll be affected by particular issues, such as police
Yeah.
brutality.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, I think another group that is largely affected, and this is because of terrorism and looking at issues of how the system responds to radicalization. If you're a young Somali man, then I'd say there's also a little bit of a higher risk. Young Muslim man is a bit of a higher risk. This is not just in Kenya, this is in terms of the response to terrorism globally, but in Kenya, there have been instances of enforced disappearances, and extrajudicial killings affecting persons that are suspected of whether it's being radicalized or persons that have come back from Somalia. So I'd say the religious disparity is also something that is in existence. Those two are the major ones for me. The third one would just be whether in instances where, say, the state uses the police as a tool or as a means towards an end. Again, that would not happen only in Kenya. I feel like this would happen primarily in formerly colonized countries. It happens a lot within the continent, where the police operate more as an authority than a service. And so in instances where the system or someone uses the police as a tool or as a means of a particular end, then you'll find that you're arrested in the middle of the night as an activist because you blogged something, you wrote something, or you said something. Then in response to your second question, is there accountability? So in Kenya, the Independent Police Oversight Authority was created to address police brutality and police abuse of power. It is brilliant that it was created. I think since IPOA was created, we have seen a little bit of progress. I still think there's a lot to be done because IPOA doesn't have as much authority as it should have to be able to deal with an issue as big as this. The reason is, one, I feel like they can be better resourced. They can be given more money, more resource. Two, they can be given more power and more authority, because at the end of the day, what happens is the police will protect each other, just like it happens in any other country, like in the US. They'll protect each other. And therefore, I feel like independent police oversight authority should have more authority to be able to implement or to be able to investigate, to be able to arrest. They have issues with being able to gather or get evidence. And I just think there's more work that can be done. Even in terms of prosecution, it's very difficult to prosecute cases. We've had a few wins, but I feel like at the end of the day, that accountability is important, but it is still, for me, it is still solving a symptom. We're still solving the issue when it is too late. We need to have a strong accountability mechanism, but the prevention is core, and the prevention is what we should be focusing on. So in terms of whether there's accountability, I feel like there's been conversations around police reforms. Those have already started. I don't think they're going at a fast enough pace. For example, I know for a fact we don't have enough policies to address sexual misconduct within the police. That has not even been addressed. But we also look at issues around their housing, issues around how much the police are paid, mental health support that they receive. Again, police community relations. There's so much that needs to be looked at in terms of reforms that we have not done as a nation. But it's nice that we have started the conversations. So different players need to act over here. It's the Ministry of Interior, it's the police itself, the policing system as is. It is the executive, it's the parliament, to ensure that policies are passed that are in favor of the reforms that exist. It's the community, it's civil society, it's the media, and how we share stories that involve police brutality and the police, and what sort of narratives we are building. There's so many different players that we should be considering, such that when you talk about accountability, for me, it's a very, very big conversation. And we are just beginning to scratch the tip of that iceberg with the different organizations and authorities that are currently doing any sort of work within the space. That said, again, I think I am glad that we are definitely ahead. We're better off than we were years ago. The fact that this is even a conversation right now without fear, the fact that people will even go to the streets to protest, the fact that a cop was actually given a life sentence, I think, was it last month or 2 months ago, for me is humongous. I think that was for like a cop who defiled a child, right? I can't remember the exact substance of the case. But I feel like there's progress. We need to celebrate that progress and then keep
Mhm.
charging or keep moving forward.